Um, I've mainly worked as a journalist all my life. I got my doctorate at Berkeley 6 years ago when I was 56, so I'm sort of an accidental, late-in-life academic. But mostly I've worked on this effort more as kind of a specialized journalist, with an expertise in public health. So I have done this mainly as an investigative reporter, and I think that's caused some difficulty in some ways for the people I've been criticizing, because they kind of don't quite know, I'm not behaving often like an academic. I've torn up papers and thrown them in the air, and I've cursed and used bad words in public about their work. So basically, I've been very harshly critical. I'm actually curious of how many of you actually know about the PACE trial. Can you raise your hands? And how many of you know about all the awful, stupid things in the PACE trial and all the problems with the PACE trial? Sort of. Okay. And how many of you actually have read some of my work, or recently have read and are aware that a news article is coming out soon that seems like it will be criticizing patients and criticizing me for my work, and it will be including, I think, accusations that I have engaged in, quote, harassment of these researchers. And I've written something about that in advance. So I basically feel like I've engaged in very tough, probably sometimes obnoxious criticism. I say that makes me tough and obnoxious. It doesn't make me engaging in harassment. I find that it seems in the UK anyway, or maybe there's a difference in terms of how one would define that term. In my country, well, especially now, unfortunately, with our president. But anyway, strong language does not constitute harassment, and so I don't feel like I've harassed anybody. I feel like I've been straightforward. I've been tough. I've said things about their work that nobody would want to have said about their work. And they haven't really provided any adequate responses to the concerns raised. They've just basically leveled charges of harassment, which is what they've done for years with patients. So that's not to say that they haven't received horrible emails or they haven't received awful messages. I have no idea. I haven't seen them. I take them at their word that they have received nasty, perhaps threatening stuff. I don't know. But they have used anything like that to basically define anybody who criticizes them as engaged in some sort of illegitimate, quote, campaign to, make their research look bad. The problem is their research is bad. And so they really have no justification for the methodological and ethical violations that they have perpetrated, and then have sort of foisted these treatments based on bad research onto patients who really have not been in a great position or had enough authority or ability to really counter these kinds of claims. So basically, that's kind of a preamble. Thing of beauty. How many of you have heard of Sir Simon Wesley in the UK? Okay, so he's the very prominent psychiatrist who first developed the theory more than 3 decades ago, actually, I guess it would be, in a 1989 paper about kind of dysfunctional beliefs and the whole kind of vicious cycle that patients purportedly fall into because they have some sort of ideations about having an illness. So he's called PACE. He wasn't a PACE author, but he was involved in the trial. And he has called PACE a thing of beauty, and I have called it a pile of crap. So I assume crap translates. Do people know what crap is in... Yes? Everybody know what crap is? Okay, I don't have to define that. Okay. So this is me. Conflicts of interest. So basically, Michael Sharp, who is one of the PACE authors, has accused me of my crowdfunding. Some of you may know that I've crowdfunded for the last 2 years. And so basically, it's true that currently most of my work on this campaign is funded by contributions primarily from patients and a little bit from my mother. So, I don't know if my mother donating $1,000 to my campaign is considered a conflict of interest, but in any event, apparently the fact that I've raised donations from patients means to Professor Sharp that I really have no business doing this, I will point out that Professor Sharp and his colleagues, the principal investigators of PACE, had very serious undisclosed conflicts of interest, which participants didn't know about. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but they all have long-standing ties, or have had long-standing ties, to disability insurance companies, which adjudicate questions of whether people should get benefits if they're disabled. So they didn't disclose this from the documents I saw to participants in the PACE trial. So those are undisclosed conflicts of interest. My conflicts of interest, such as they are apparent. You can go on my crowdfunding page and you can see every single person who donated. So, basically, yes, it's true that I would rather not have had to have done that. I would rather that this work was viewed as important enough or serious enough to be funded by media organizations and so on, but it's not. So this was the way, once my Berkeley position changed, that I was able to continue this work. I will point out that Professor Sharp has said that I am getting paid, quote, to trash the PACE trial or something to that effect. I have pointed out that I was perfectly happy to trash the PACE trial for at least 2 years before I asked anybody for any money at all. So, I consider I'm just continuing my work that I was doing for free as a public service, and, like anybody, I like to get paid. So that's where we are now. This one, okay. So there's a lot of questions about the PACE trial. So I'm going to talk mainly about the PACE trial. I have recently also reported, how many of you have heard of Professor Esther Crawley? She's a pediatrician at the University of Bristol in the UK. And I have written a lot about some of her bad research. And recently, last week, I reported that there is now an official investigation of some of her studies at University of Bristol. So it seems that my criticisms have been validated, at least to the point that someone in authority thinks that they need to be looked at further. I have limited access to some of the documentation, so whoever's doing the investigation now will presumably have more access to some of the documentation. But the questions with all these trials in the CBT, GET domain are that basically they're open label or unblinded trials. That means everybody knows, patients and the researchers know essentially who's getting what treatment. Okay, so that's a difficult problem in research, but with certain things, behavioral modification things, you can't disguise treatments, right? You can't disguise whether something is graded exercise therapy or whether you're not getting graded exercise therapy. That's understandable. The problem is they combine those by relying solely on subjective outcomes. So that means that at the end of 6 months, all you're doing is saying, hey, how do you feel? You got CBT, do you feel better? Or you got GET, do you feel better? You're not using any objective tests to assess that. Now, they did use objective tests in PACE, but they rejected all, they didn't work, and so basically they've rejected all of them as not objective after all, mostly. Not 3 of the 4 they've specifically basically disavowed. The 4th one they haven't really said much about. The point is that if you combine these 2 elements in one trial, you simply cannot get good data, because we all understand that if people want to get better, people also, if you're in a therapeutic relationship and you're basically told as the CBT, those in CBT and GET in PACE, we're told this has already been shown to make people better, you can get better from this, and so on and so forth. So they were given messages that are essentially designed or essentially have the effect of biasing their responses. At the end of 6 months or a year, if you ask people who got a treatment, telling them over and over that this would make them better, they're more likely to say, yes, I feel better, than those who did not get the treatment and were not told for 6 months or 3 months or whatever that they were going to get better from the treatment or whatever it was they were getting. So there's a reason why we don't use trials with this design to approve pharmaceuticals or to approve drug treatments, because the evidence is not reliable. Now, since you can't always blind studies, you can't just then rely on subjective outcomes. It's not either one of those alone makes the study impossible, but if you combine those 2 elements in one study, and that's what you're basing your results on, that's a big problem. So these are overarching questions. Then there are very specific questions that pertain to PACE. Oops, not that. Okay, which one did I this one? Okay, here. So these are more big questions. I'm sorry for all the text. I know it can be hard to read. I'm terrible with technology, so I can't do lots of pretty pictures, jumping up and down, and colors and stuff. So basically, why have I kept on this for a number of years? One of the things for me that's so astonishing about PACE is that when they redefined after the fact what they meant by recovery, it turned out that 13% of their participants were already, quote, recovered at baseline on their one of their two primary outcomes, which was physical function, self-reported physical function. So my question is, I don't understand how anybody could publish such a study with such an analysis. It is ridiculous. It is just impossible. Since it is not possible to be disabled simultaneously and recovered simultaneously on a measure, those people, why were they in the trial in the first place? The whole thing is a mess. So does a study with that thing actually have a legitimate place in the domain called science? I would say not. Is there a place in science for a study in which participants were simultaneously disabled and recovered? I say no. Why has a study containing this paradox been defended for so long by the UK academic and medical establishment? And I can add the Norwegian medical establishment and the Danish medical establishment and the Dutch medical establishment, and I assume the Finnish medical establishment. It is incomprehensible to anybody normal who has seen this study. When I showed this study to my colleagues at Berkeley before I took this on as a project, they were like, I can't believe this nonsense. How could this have been published? This is crazy. As soon as I showed the PACE trial to my colleagues at Berkeley, it began being used in epidemiology coursework in courses in Berkeley as an excellent example of a terrible study. So basically now students get it for a month, they analyze it and they look at it, and then they get presentations to the other students about how awful it is and the terrible things they did. In the terrible things they did in their methodology and sort of methodological approach. And so that's the other thing. Why have patients been defamed for pointing out that this disqualifying feature of the study? And why is it controversial that I'm saying this is unacceptable? I really, really don't understand that. It's very much the emperor has no clothes or Alice in Wonderland. It's insane. It's literally insane. And these people claiming that patients are climate change deniers because they don't accept PACE, they're the climate change deniers, they're the ones who are like climate change deniers, and they are doing everything they can to slam patients and slam me so they don't actually have to answer for their terrible science. So saying these things basically, I think, is what qualifies me from the perspective of these authors as harassing them. To me, this is surprising because all I'm doing is engaging in what I was trained to do at Berkeley, which is critique science. Okay, so this is just a brief history. Now, there's a long history of outbreaks of something that looks like what we think of as ME, but the truth is, you know, from the 30s in LA and elsewhere and Iceland and everywhere, we really have no idea what those outbreaks were or if they're the same thing as what we now call ME. We do know that in 1955 there was an outbreak at the Royal Free Hospital in London, and it was treated as a viral illness, and afterwards it was named, this syndrome was named benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. Benign in the medical sense that nobody seemed to be dying from it, not in the sense that, you know, people don't use the benign anymore, even though I guess it's officially still in the WHO category. So we don't really know if that was the same thing as what people having ME now is. We just don't know because no pathogen was found. And we really don't know exactly what ME is or why people are getting so sick or why they continue to have these relapses and so on. We just don't know. And I'm not making any claims about, I've never made any claims about what I think it actually is. All I've been saying is that the science that they've tried to, that they've published is bad. So I'm not a medical doctor. I've never made any claims to having biological, advanced biological training. I'm not commenting on whether this research is good or that research is good into the biomedical aspects. All I'm saying is that this research that I'm talking about is bad. In 1970, psychiatrists in the UK reinterpreted the Royal Free outbreak as a case of mass hysteria. There are two main reasons, rationales were that there was no pathogen identified, which is true, and also that the majority of those identified in the outbreak, the majority of those who got sick were women. They were nurses. So of course, since they were women, it was understandably mass hysteria, sort of by definition, according, one would think. Since again, and we can sort of see that a lot of these, what people are having is what probably most everybody with it would formerly in the 19th century have been identified as having neurasthenia or as having hysteria or something like that. Now we're calling it ME. In 1988, a team from the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S., or led by the Centers for Disease Control, there was an outbreak at Lake Tahoe in Nevada, and they called it chronic fatigue syndrome. They did not call it myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's clear that people were very, very sick in Lake Tahoe. There is... well, anyway, we can talk about that later. There are lots of theories about what was going on there, but again, no one quite knows. Some people think it was definitely mold-related. I have no idea what it was related to or what it exactly was. But in any event, the CDC decided that it should be called chronic fatigue syndrome and that's the name that we've been stuck with since. In 1989, Simon Wesley and colleagues wrote their first paper, or as far as I can tell, one of the first papers, proposing this hypothesis about deconditioning and false illness beliefs. Then they started doing these small studies. Of course, all of them were, as I said, open-label trials with subjective outcomes, so they really don't provide any reliable data. But they did appear to confirm this hypothesis. 2005, PACE was started. The PACE results on improvement were published in The Lancet. That's when I first became aware of it. And the PACE recovery results were published in a journal called Psychological Medicine. And there's been since then other publications and other developments, but that's basically where we are. So basically, one of the big issues that makes things research difficult is that there are 20 case definitions, or more than 20 case definitions. One of the problems, especially with the PACE and some of the UK studies and some of the Dutch studies, is that they use the so-called Oxford criteria. And the Oxford criteria, one thing, am I talking too fast for people? Do I need to slow down? Can everybody understand me? Okay, yeah? Okay. Yes, no? Okay. Please stop me if something's not clear. So the Oxford criteria is basically 6 months of unexplained debilitating fatigue. Now, you don't have to be a genius or a psychiatrist, even though the psychiatrist developed this. You don't need to be a genius to figure out that 6 months of unexplained fatigue is a proxy for a lot of things, depression, anxiety disorders, those produce fatigue. There's a lot of people who have unexplained fatigue that we don't actually understand, but they don't have other symptoms that we would characterize as being part of ME. So basically, this is a very large, heterogeneous group of, when you define people with just on a fatigue basis, you get a much larger group than if you actually have more specific symptoms that you're looking at. So basically, any studies that include the Oxford criteria are likely to include many people with, as I said, undiagnosed anxiety and depression disorders and so on. And for some of those people, it might be that cognitive behavior therapy, psychotherapy is obviously used for depression, and so is exercise. So basically, if you have people in your groups that don't have ME, or what we're calling ME, but have some other kind of undiagnosed depression or anxiety disorder, or a diagnosed depression or anxiety disorder, because in PACE, 47% of the subjects actually were identified as having, I don't know if it's just depression or some sort of major psychiatric issues. Those people may benefit, and it will look like people with ME will benefit because you're basically identifying all of them as having the illness. Slightly better, but not very good, Fukuda criteria from the CDC in 1994. This required the 6 months of unexplained debilitating fatigue, and it added 8 other symptoms that you had to have 4 of them. The 8 other symptoms are all symptoms of what one might call ME, or what one would call ME. The problem is that the ones that really characterize ME, which are post-exertional malaise, or whatever one decides to call it, sleep dysfunction, and cognitive difficulties, are not required. There are 3 of the 8, along muscle pain as well. They're not required. They're just 3 of the 8. So you could just have the others and not have those and be identified as having chronic fatigue syndrome by this definition. So again, you're going to get samples that may not have people with the illness. Now, to be fair, it's very hard without a specific blood test or other kind of diagnostic test to identify who has this illness that we're talking about. So I have some sympathy for researchers trying to do that. However, that doesn't mean that it's right to use very general, non-specific criteria like 6 months of fatigue to identify people. There are more specific criteria. The NICE guidance in the UK, I think it actually requires, I'm sorry, this may be a mistake, it probably requires for kids, I think it requires 4 months. I'm not sure. It may require 4 months, not 6 months. But it requires only 1 of 10 other symptoms. There were 2 definitions that patients have preferred. One was the 2003 Canadian consensus criteria, and many people in the same group have then in 2011 developed the international consensus criteria, which many patients really prefer. Both of these, well, the 2011 one included post-exertional malaise, although they called it post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion, and they also required neurological and other symptoms to be part of it. So that's one that patients prefer. Many patients prefer. Other patients like the 2003 CCC. In 2015, the Institute of Medicine, which is in the U.S. now called the National Academy of Medicine, came up with not a very good name, systemic exertion intolerance disease, or SAID, I don't know how to pronounce it in English. No one liked the name, and many people, for various reasons, don't like the definition, but this was their definition. They did include post-exertional malaise, unrefreshing sleep, and cognitive dysfunction and/or orthostatic intolerance as core symptoms. One of the problems with this definition is that it doesn't exclude people with primary psychiatric disorders. The issue is that some case definitions are designed as research case definitions, and some definitions are designed for doctors to diagnose. And you actually need sort of different criteria, because in a research study you do want a more well-defined sample, because you want to make sure you get definitive results. If you're a clinician, you want to be able to treat anybody who might have the illness just to get them into care. So this was developed as a clinical case definition and is now unfortunately being used as a research case definition, which is a real problem. This is all just to say that a lot of the research is hard to compare, because if you're using different definitions, it can be hard to say, well, this is the same population group as that one that's being studied. So it does create a lot of problems for researchers. So in 2015 was a big year, because we had 2 reports, one from the the Institute of Medicine in the U.S., and one from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. The Institute of Medicine, they both reviewed all the studies. There are thousands of studies that show, or that seem to show, biological issues. These were all reviewed. So this is the IOM declared that ME/CFS is a serious, chronic, complex, and multi-system disease that frequently and dramatically limits the activities of affected patients. It rejects the idea that it's psychiatric, a depressive or anxiety disorder, functional, neurological, and so on and so forth, or that it's caused by deconditioning and false illness beliefs. Basically, the framing of the report implicitly rejects these notions. It makes it clear that this is a physiological illness, although what it actually is not clear, and exactly what's happening is still not clear. The report refocuses away from fatigue and names exertion intolerance as the cardinal symptom, which was very helpful. The National Institutes of Health report also basically came up that it was a physiological illness, and they suggested that the Oxford criteria, which I mentioned, is harmful for research and should be retired. The reason why they said that is obviously the reason that I suggested, which is that it, as anybody knows, the Oxford criteria defines a very, very large heterogeneous sample of people, and so you don't want to have a study in which all those people are thrown into one thing, because they don't all have the same thing. Many of them have something other than ME, most likely. So, okay, PACE was identified by the researchers as the definitive study of CBT and GET. They have since sort of said, well, we only said definitive once or something like that. So they've sort of tried to disavow their own claim that it was a definitive trial. But that's how it was set up, and that's how it was presented. As I said, it was open label with subjective outcomes. They did have objective outcomes, 4 of them. But they basically, as I said, they didn't support the subjective findings, so they basically ignored all of them as kind of irrelevant. It used the Oxford criteria, which conflates chronic fatigue and ME, so we don't actually know that much about their sample. We don't actually know exactly who was in their sample. They had 641 participants. 4 trial arms: cognitive behavior therapy, graded exercise therapy, something they called adaptive pacing therapy, which was their version of pacing. So it wasn't pacing. They didn't test pacing. They only tested their own operation, what we call an operationalization of the concept of pacing. It goes without saying that when you turn a self-help strategy into a therapy with diaries and guidelines and a therapist, you're actually changing it from what it was. So they weren't testing the self-help strategy called pacing. They were testing their own therapy that they designed called adaptive pacing therapy. So any claims that they subsequently have made, or anybody's made, that based on pace has shown that pacing is not effective, is completely ridiculous and not warranted by the study. The study only showed that what they did, adaptive pacing therapy, in the way they measured things in a bogus way, was not helpful as they interpreted it. The last one was specialist medical care, which was basically you go see your doctor 1 or 2 times or 3 times. Everybody in the trial got specialist medical care. One group got only specialist medical care. These were the 3 principal investigators. They all probably loathe me and wish I would fall off the face of the earth. The study was based on the unproven theory that they've been proposing since 1989, that all symptoms are due to deconditioning because of patients' dysfunctional cognitions about their illness. In the PACE trial, they do say, well, just because these things seem to work doesn't imply anything about what causes the disease. But if you look at the descriptions of the treatments or the alleged treatments, it's clear. They're defining it. This is their theory that there is no underlying illness, that this can be completely reversed by these strategies. That's clear from the way they describe the treatments. They now sort of fudge that, well, kind of, we never really said that, or we always said there could be biological, so on and so forth, but it's all kind of after-the-fact justifications. So basically, in the last few years especially, one of the problems all along has been that there's not that much money, so someone can do only a small study and not a major big study, and then they do a small study that finds something, but they don't have the money to do a much bigger study to verify what they found. So that's been a big problem all along. In the last few years, there has been more money in the U.S. Here's some places going on in the U.S. The National Institutes of Health has, funded a batch of, I think 4 or 5 centers where they're, giving them some millions of dollars. And so there has been more activity. In UK, for example, Newcastle and University College London are places where some research is going on. There are multiple theories about what's going on. No one really quite knows. For many patients, obviously, they get an illness after an acute infection, and then they never quite get better. In some studies, it seems to indicate that this acute infection is triggering sort of hyperimmune and inflammatory responses. There's a lot of, myalgic encephalomyelitis, the encephalomyelitis actually means inflammation of the brain and central nervous system. It's very hard to prove or to demonstrate inflammation in the brain, but, there are some indications that that is what's going on. Apparently, this just, there's a disruption of neurological functioning. In some studies, this seems to indicate that there are mitochondrial inefficiencies in energy production. Do people know the mitochondria is the part of the cells where energy is produced? I don't know why I'm doing this. I have cells here, like everybody. So mitochondria are sort of little, in every cell, or in cells there are mitochondria, which basically are the part that produce the energy. And it's possible that there's some kind of missignaling going on in the brain. They talk about this a lot as a possible thing in fibromyalgia, that you're responding that there's an excessive over-response to stimulus. Now, that can also be interpreted as psychological, which is part of the problem, but it is possible that there's some neurological misfiring or misfunctioning or missignaling in the brain, so things are being interpreted in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect the actual stimulus, or that makes people respond more sensitively to stimuli than other people. Because as you know, it's not just exercise or whatever. It's lights and sounds. For people who are severe, they have a lot of hyper responses to stimuli, and nobody really knows quite what's going on. The psychiatrist would probably say it's psychogenic, that it's being, again, it's kind of a delusion of something, but it might be related to some sort of missignaling. Again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, so I'm agnostic on whatever. I can't really speak to that. I'm just saying this is what some of the theories being proposed. Most likely, one of the difficulties is that it's a spectrum of multiple kinds of disorders or a cluster of similar disorders. So it might be environmental toxins. It might It might be mold. That was one of the possible things that people talk about, Lake Tahoe. It might be sometimes people report it after a surgery that causes physical trauma. Other physiological insults that might trigger or be a co-trigger for the illness. Anytime we're under stress, our body is responding. So basically, any sorts of stressful physiological insults produce responses in the body that might trigger this. It's possible that because it runs in families, there seems to likely be genetic links possibly. There's some evidence of that or some a thought about that. It also seems that even though it often seems that people just get glandular fever or something and then get sick, sometimes when doctors take histories, they find that, well, there was an earlier infection someone took a bit longer to respond to, or there was some prolonged illness in childhood. And so it may be that there's kind of, it isn't just someone gets sick and suddenly they continue, but that if someone goes back and looks at their history, it might be signals along the way that people have had some sort of growing issue and then something finally pushes it over the edge. That might be the experience of some of you as well if you think about your own histories. Oh, okay, so these are just some of the places where what I think of as this bogus research is going on, and as we know, Scandinavia is one place. So, yeah, these are the people I've been sort of trying to debunk. So the PACE trial, basically the first results were published in The Lancet. They claimed around 60% improved. They said twice as many, quote, got back to normal. Commentary said 30% met strict criterion for recovery. This was completely ridiculous and really has been challenged, but they insist that it's an accurate statement, that that was their opinion, so that's okay to say that. In 2013, they claimed that 22% recovered. My series was initially published on Virology blog, is hosted by a colleague and friend of mine at Columbia University. He's a microbiologist, well, he's a virologist. So he sort of lets me hijack his site, which long predated my work, for my work, and this was the initial thing. A patient had filed a Freedom of Information request seeking the raw trial data because they wanted to analyze the data according to what the researchers had actually promised to do, even though they changed everything that they did after the fact, or many things. They changed many things after the fact. The tribunal ordered Queen Mary University of London, which was the home of Peter White, the primary investigator, to turn over the raw trial data. This decision was quite scathing in dismissing the responses, the defenses of the university about why they should not have to release this data. The PACE team themselves, in advance of the release of the data, acknowledged that per their protocol measures of improvement, they would have only reported improvement rates of 20 to 21% instead of 60%. When you add in the fact that 10% improved, according to this definition, without any treatment at all, without any of these treatments at all, that means that really, by their own protocol, only 1 in 10 improved had statistically significant improvement with their treatments. Now, 1 in 10 is pretty small for a treatment that you're essentially forcing on everybody. And again, that's certainly within the rates of what one would expect from a placebo effect if you're telling people that the treatments they're getting are in fact going to make them better. So there was a publication in 2018, I was a co-author, that basically reanalyzed the improvement, the recovery, and long-term results. Basically, recovery, under their original protocol definition, they would have gotten just in the single digits. So the highest was 7%, but there was no statistically significant difference between any of the groups in their own initial recovery. So it's not surprising that in the end they changed their results in a way that made it look like they did get recovery. So that was published. The conclusion is that the PACE outcome switching changes null or placebo-induced results into decent ones. No long-term benefits from CBT and GET. Just to be clear, how many of you know what a trial protocol is? So when you're doing a clinical trial, in order to get approvals, and in order to get consent, in order to get the money from whoever your funder is, you need to write up, or you're supposed to do a protocol. The protocol lays out everything you're supposed to do. And why do we do that? Well, because there was a history of researchers doing studies and then just picking at the end which results they liked and then presenting them. That's not science. That's just cherry picking your whatever results you want to present and making them look good. So there's basically principal investigators, in this case the PACE authors, are supposed to write a protocol. So they spent a couple of years writing a very long protocol with very specific, clear indications of what they were going to do, which were their primary outcomes, how they defined recovery, and so on. Lo and behold, when they published their papers, those primary outcomes, the measures had changed. They got permission, in some cases, to change them, in some cases not. Well, they got permission to change their primary outcomes. They did not get permission from their oversight committees to change their definition of recovery. However, whether they got permission or not, all the changes that they did make led to better-looking results that allowed them to make better claims of success. This is very clear from the reanalysis that was published in this, and it's very clear from if you look at the raw trial data that was released. When it's okay in some cases to change your protocol, however, there's a method. What you're supposed to do when you do that is you're supposed to publish an analysis as well that either provides your original data that per your original promises. And remember, you got money and the permission to do the study based on what you promised to do. It is not okay to just change that and then not provide either the original data that you were promised to do, or to do something called a sensitivity analysis, which is a way that you kind of measure what changes in assumptions, in this case outcome, ways of measuring outcomes, what impact that has on the findings. So when they published the PACE papers, they did not indicate anything about what their original findings would have been. They only presented their what I would call manipulated findings based on new outcome measures that were not in their protocol. That's really, really, really not allowed. And it is shocking, actually, that it was allowed to happen in this case and that the journals involved did not see this as a problem. So here are some responses that I got. One of the things that I want to always make it clear that I didn't do anything that patients hadn't already known. I piggybacked totally on the patient's own analyses and discoveries, and I just was able to bring my academic credentials, such as they are, to bear and to connect with colleagues who had not much to do with the study, to look at it and to say, this is really a total piece of garbage. So my friend Bruce Levin, not my friend, I didn't know him before I engaged with this, but my colleague, called it the height of clinical trial amateurism. Now, I've called it a piece of crap. Anybody who knows anything about how academics talk about other research would understand that to call something the height of clinical trial amateurism is essentially the academic equivalent of calling something much worse than a piece of crap. Researchers simply do not say this kind of thing about other pieces, research that they're not involved with, unless it is really, really, really egregious. A really bad situation. So Professor Ron Davis, I'm shocked the Lancet published it. I don't understand how it got through any kind of peer review. Now, the PACE authors would say that he has a vested interest. His son is very, very sick, and he's doing everything he can. He's a well-known geneticist, and he's now very involved in ME research. Basically, I mean, his son is very sick. He has an obvious interest in finding treatments. Jonathan Edwards, University College London, it's a massive incomprehensibility to me. David Tuller, a piece of crap. Carol Monahan, who has taken this on in the UK, has called it one of the biggest medical scandals of the 21st century. I've asked her if she would amend that and call it one of the biggest medical scandals of the current millennium, even though the millennium is only 19 years old. But I think it might be a fair statement, even though we have no idea what other horrible research will be produced or whether our species will even be around in the next 100 years, given the current global environmental conditions. In any event, that's a pretty harsh statement, and it's been great that she said that. Simon Wesley called it a thing of beauty. I thank him for that phrase because it's a part of my title. And Professor Esther Crawley, my BFF at Bristol University, has called it a great, great trial. I have argued that perhaps now that it's known not to be a great, great trial, that this could possibly harm her credibility, and that may be one of the reasons why she thinks I'm harassing her. Okay, so this is my my first piece, thanks to my colleague, Dr. Racaniello. So there were some developments after this happened. What I decided to do was I thought that you'd publish something like this and it would immediately invalidate the study because the violations of basic core principles of scientific investigation are violated. That didn't happen, so I started organizing open letters, which I thought would be an effective way to disseminate further my information and to make it more, I'm just David Tuller. When you have 42 leading scientists, academics, saying this is a piece of garbage, essentially, that creates more of an impression. So I organized these open letters. The letter said such flaws have no place in published research. The letter demanded an independent investigation. Dr. Horton, who's the editor of The Lancet, who had ignored previously many things that I'd written, contacted Dr. Racaniello and requested a letter for publication. The Lancet shockingly then rejected the letter after giving the PACE authors veto power over it. They said nothing new here, and so they didn't publish it. Obviously, it is something new, even though the complaints had been made before. There was nothing new about the specific complaints because patients had already made them. There was something new that 42 top academics and experts and doctors from around the world, mainly from the US, were calling it a piece of garbage. That didn't seem to, and again, you don't request a letter for publication from 42 busy academics and then reject it with a form letter because you vetted it with the PACE authors. Now that had an effect because it was cited. I made sure to get that out and posted before the tribunal hearing where that the patient was trying to get the data. And so the tribunal hearing cited the open letter in response to the PACE authors' continuing arguments that only hysterical crazy patients, I'm paraphrasing, that only hysterical crazy climate change denying patients think there's any problem with PACE. The tribunal decision essentially said, well, I don't know, there's this letter signed by prominent people, I'm not sure that's actually right. So I really specifically got that letter out in order to hopefully have the patient be able to submit it with his brief to the tribunal. The following year, we posted an open letter to Psychological Medicine that had 101 individuals and 40 organizations demanded retraction because those findings are completely bogus for reasons we'll talk. And then just this last year, there was a new open letter to The Lancet, 114 experts, 10 MPs, 70 organizations, got coverage in the Times of London, the UK Times, and BMJ. To me, the Times is the New York Times. So if I say Times, I have to remember it's not the New York Times, it's in the UK. And it got covered in BMJ. And the Medical Research Council, which was the main funder of PACE, basically defended PACE and said, no, we think it was okay. But it put them on the spot. So these are there are many, many, many things. I wrote a 15,000-word exposition of PACE, and I couldn't cover everything. These were three of the things that I particularly found interesting and bizarre issues. These are things that might possibly be cause, I think, for retraction, although other people have different ideas about what would force retraction. The study design, that it was an open label with subjective outcomes and the use for an Oxford criteria, those are bad science, but they don't warrant retraction. Basically, you're allowed to do bad science as long as you follow the rules. Unless you're really violating very specific things, you don't get a retraction. Maybe you might need to make a correction or something, but basically, this study design is accepted, and the Oxford criteria is a published set of criteria, so you can't really claim this is, warrants retraction. You can just point to it and say it's really bad science and kind of stupid. So, outcome switching. Outcome switching is when you do what I was talking about, when you just change things, in the middle of a trial or at the end of a trial or at some point in a trial after you've already started your trial. This was rampant in PACE, and it's also sort of rampant in a lot of the stuff. I've documented this as well in Professor Crawley's work. In her case, she didn't even disclose it, actually, in the paper that she did about the lightning process, that the outcomes were changed halfway through. You cannot hide salient information like that. It's really, really not allowed. So in this case, I'm just going to look at one of the outcome swaps. How many of you are familiar with this particular problem of PACE that you could be, quote, recovered and disabled simultaneously? Okay, this is how they did it. If you look at the protocol, well, okay, so first, the entry on physical function is a scale of 0 to 100. 0, you're basically you're a corpse. 100, you're great. Most normal people, measure 85, 90, 95, even if with some disability. Basically, most people in a population, in a normal population, have high scores. So in PACE, the entry score required to demonstrate disability is 65 or less. That's probably an appropriate. 65 would be fairly disabled. In the protocol, you needed 85 to be counted to have recovery for physical function. Now, I want to make clear that for recovery, there were 4 separate criteria, and you had to be recovered on each criterion to be recovered overall. They weakened all 4 of the criteria dramatically. This was the most weird one, but all of them were weakened significantly. And this is the most bizarre-looking one. So basically, in the Lancet, they said they did a statistical thing calling normal range, and they said if you had 60 and above, you were within the normal range. This doesn't make much sense. If 65 and below is the reason they were able to do that is because they used the wrong statistical analysis, the wrong statistical calculation for determining their normal range, and they knew that it was a bogus way to do it because of previous research. I've documented this. I'm not going to describe it here. But in psychological medicine, that level of 60 became the recovery threshold for physical function. 13% of the 641 participants were already recovered on physical function at entry. That means that why were they in the study in the first place? And why was this important fact not disclosed in any of the published papers? Again, you cannot not disclose information that's going to impact how your results will be interpreted. Obviously, if 13% of people are recovered on one of your primary measures at baseline, and you don't disclose that, and then you do, it changes your interpretation of the results. This is a very key point, and this is one of the reasons why I have argued, as you'll see, that I think this does likely qualify as research misconduct. Multiple examples of outcome switching. They all had the effect of weakening the protocol measures. What were their responses? We changed outcome measures before seeing the results, so they were pre-specified. This is stupid and ridiculous. In an unblinded subjective trial, in a trial with unblinded trial with subjective outcomes, smart principal investigators do not need to see their results or see their actual data to know which way trends are happening. That's not the case if you're based on blood tests or based on other things, or if people are blinded to treatment. You're not going to know. But in this study design, definitely, principal investigators should know. So it doesn't matter that it was before, basically they changed this outcome after they'd collected all their data from 641 people, as far as I understand it. It doesn't matter that it was before seeing the results or before looking at the actual data, because they already should have had a sense of what was going on. In any event, it doesn't really matter also because all the things that they did were clearly ways to weaken their outcome criteria, which would automatically have the effect of improving how the results looked, or improving your reportable numbers. We decided our original measures were too stringent. This is a truly shocking acknowledgement. You can't decide that after your study. You can't decide that after you've collected data. You have to decide that during the 2 years in which you're writing a protocol, because if you can do that after the fact, why are you writing a protocol at all? If you just can change your measures because you want to, that's not acceptable after the fact. They say it doesn't matter that people were recovered on key variables, because some people were also recovered on the second key variable, which was fatigue, at baseline, but a much lower number. It doesn't matter that people were recovered on key variables because we had other recovery measures as well. Okay, as I said, this is a response from outer space. Nobody in their right mind in any study could ever possibly defend people being recovered on a measure at baseline. It is unacceptable. It is impossible in the real world. And it's preposterous that this study got published with this particular issue. So, I just don't understand these responses. The revised measures show CBT, best average results. So they changed their primary outcome from a rate, which was, 20% got better or 50% got better, to an average. Now, averages, so basically they compared the averages of all the 4 groups. Now that's an interesting piece of data. However, we all understand, like let's say, here we all are, let's say Bill Gates was in this room, right? And then we compared how much wealth we had. We would all seem like we were incredibly, incredibly rich, right? Or maybe Jeff Bezos now from Amazon. He's more rich now. So if you just looked at the average of our incomes, we would all be incredibly rich. But the only reason that would be is because there would be one person who is off the scale and everybody else has average income. It's the same with this. You don't know in an average how many outliers there are. There may be 2 or 3 outliers who did enormously well for reasons we don't understand, and everybody else did badly. So for doctors and for patients, an average is really not as useful as what percentage of people got better, what percentage of people got worse. That's what patients want to know, and that's what doctors want to be able to tell patients. So to change your primary measures from a rate, which gives you information on how many people got better and how many people got worse, to an average is unacceptable as your final result, to me. They also claim that the reanalyzers, of which I was one, tweaked their outcomes to make the results look worse. This is really funny because basically the only tweaking that was done was to untweak. They did their own unjustified tweaks to their data. The analyzers just untweaked what they tweaked without justification. So to call them tweaking, to accuse us of just tweaking their outcomes just to make the results look bad, when they themselves acknowledge that they themselves tweaked it to make things easier because they thought their measures were too stringent after the fact, is a ridiculous answer. So, okay, did not obtain informed consent. So I'm glad to be able to mention Helsinki in my talk here. So there's a document called, has anybody heard of the Declaration of Helsinki? Okay, so I hadn't really before I started this project. The Declaration of Helsinki was developed after World War II to protect human subjects in research. I think we can all understand why after World War II it was thought important to have a document that protects human subjects of research. This was first developed, and I think the first one was published, first version in the 1960s, and it's been further developed over the years. By 2005, when they did their consent forms, this is what it included on informed consent. Researchers must tell prospective participants about any possible conflicts of interest and institutional affiliations. The PACE PIs have devised disability insurance that rehabilitative therapies like CBT are indicated for ME/CFS claimants, and they've also argued that this gets people back to work, that people should not get benefits if they haven't gone through a proper course of CBT and GET. At least one of the principal investigators has been involved not just in making these points overall, but in getting involved in specific cases of people and advising the insurance company not to provide benefits unless they go through proper CBT and GET. The PACE principal investigators did not include promised disclosures in consent forms. So basically, this is a problem. If in 2005 in the UK, there were no prevailing guidelines that would have required this on its own. However, to their misfortune, the PACE principal investigators promised to adhere in their protocol, and as I said, the protocol is what you base your approvals on. They promised to adhere to the Declaration of Helsinki. They may not have realized what the Declaration of Helsinki said about informed consent, but that's not my fault or anybody's fault who complains about this. They promised to adhere to the Declaration of Helsinki. Declaration of Helsinki is extremely explicit on what required for informed consent. They have these any possible conflicts of interest. It's not just conflicts of interest, it's any possible conflicts of interest. That's a pretty broad category. So the PACE PIs have certainly possible conflicts of interest that were not disclosed. How do they answer this? So we told the journals about our possible conflicts of interest. This is bullshit. Why? Because the Declaration of Helsinki was not written to protect journal editors or journals or journal readers. It was written to protect participants in your research. So it's totally irrelevant that you made disclosures to the journals which you would have been required to make anyway. Your insurance companies were not involved in the study. This is completely non-responsive. Conflict of interest is a fairly broad concept. It means, do you have any advantage or vested interest in the findings that you're going to be producing? The answer is obviously yes. It doesn't matter whether the insurance industry paid for the study or not, or were involved in some way. You're involved with the study, and you're involved with insurance companies. That's the problem. And you didn't disclose it. Again, there was nothing prevailing in UK law, as I understand it, at the time that would have required this. I'm making the argument solely based on the fact that they promised to follow the Declaration of Helsinki, and they violated a key provision of the Declaration of Helsinki, presumably because it was more convenient for them. Another answer they gave is only 3 of the 19 investigators did work for insurance companies. Okay, well, actually, it was 4 of them, and the three that did, that they claim, were the principal investigators. So I don't understand why this is relevant to anything. So you disclose those ones, and then you say the others had no conflicts of interest. What's the problem? You can see I get a little agitated and upset and, angry. Really, I don't understand this behavior. Okay, so another thing was this participant newsletter. They had a series of participant newsletters that they posted. I don't know if they sent them to participants, but they posted them on their website. This was the third one, I think. And there's nothing inherently wrong with participant newsletters. What you can't do is what they did. They included testimonials from past participants. This is participants who had finished the trial, so these were statements being read by people currently in the trial about how fantastic the trial was. The therapy was excellent, being included in this trial has helped me tremendously, I found the treatment extremely useful, and blah, blah, blah. They also included in this newsletter a short article about the new NICE guidance, which had come out in 2007. So NICE, again, is the national, it's a weird name, but anyway, basically is the quasi-independent body that, or the independent body or the quasi-government body. It's kind of got a middle status that develops, excuse me, that develops clinical guidelines for various illnesses in the UK. And so doctors, they're not required that doctors follow them, but they're considered the standard of care, just like sort of the Centers for Disease Control in the US. So the NICE guidelines recommend CBT and GET based on the best available evidence. They reported that in a study, in a newsletter for participants in a study in which they were testing whether CBT and GET were effective. I'm sorry, you cannot do that. What were their answers? The treatment arms were not mentioned in testimonials, so there could have been no bias. I say it's hard to know how to respond to such a claim because let's look at what it's true. They extracted the names of the specific treatment arms, but if you look at the oh, that's not the right one. Okay, I don't think anybody would think that any of these related to specialized medical care, specialist medical care, which was only 1 or 2, 3 meetings with your doctor. So obviously, while they claimed that they took testimonials from every arm, these seem fairly clear to me that these are probably the active arms of the treatment, and in any event, it doesn't matter. You're not allowed to bias anybody in your sample in any direction. It's ridiculous to claim that there could have been no bias. No, you're biasing everybody in a positive direction if you're reporting that previous participants, unless you're going to report equally participants saying, I hated this study, and I've talked to people who got no better. So unless you're including those as well, you certainly can't claim that you're not inducing bias. You're obviously inducing bias by these kinds of things. The article about NICE in the newsletter mentioned not just CBT and GET, but activity management, which was the third treatment offered in PACE. So the statement in the newsletter could not have induced bias. Okay, the third arm in PACE was adaptive pacing therapy. Whether they think it's the same as activity management is completely irrelevant. It wasn't called activity management. It was called adaptive pacing therapy. And it can't possibly have been activity management. Why not? Because the PACE authors kept saying how adaptive pacing therapy was being tested for the first time in this study. It was operationalized version of pacing for this study. So there's no way it's the same as activity management. And to make this claim is ridiculous. Oh, this was one of my things. A colleague of mine at Berkeley, I showed him the newsletter. And he kind of looked at it and he was like really perplexed. He said, you mean they published this during the trial? And I'm like, yeah. What do you think? And he said, well, I was like, did they violate any things? He said, you know, I guess there's no prohibition against publishing positive testimonials in a trial, but I think it's because it never occurred to anybody that anybody would try to pull such a stunt. Now, I wanted to quote him, but he didn't want to be quoted for the reason that most scientists don't want to get engaged in fights that they're not involved with. But I thought that was a great quote, and I really, confirmed my own feelings about the newsletter. So I want to say also that, again, a lot of the stuff I could look at and say, well, this is what I think, but I really checked everything I wrote with colleagues who are smarter than me and who are epidemiologists, which I'm not, and who are biostatisticians, which I'm not. So I really felt very comfortable going through this, that I was, completely on solid ground in making these criticisms. So is PACE an example of research misconduct? Here are a couple of definitions. The first is from the Medical Research Council in the UK, which would really be the prevailing set of guidelines. This is one of their planks. Misrepresentation of data, for example, suppression of relevant findings and or data, or knowingly, recklessly, or by gross negligence presenting a flawed interpretation of data. Also from the MRC, misrepresentation of interests, including failure to declare material interests either of the researcher or of the funders of the research. For the National Institutes of Health in the US, the category falsification, which is similar to the misrepresentation, manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. You know, I would say, let me go back. How did I go back again? Okay. So yeah, I would say that the things I've presented do suggest that this could be identified as or investigated as research misconduct. I've made clear that I might have my opinion about it, but I'm not the person authorized to adjudicate whether something is research misconduct. So I can't state definitively that it's research misconduct, but I can say that it kind of looks like it from my, you know, humble perspective. I will also say that, well, let me conclude. And other people can draw their own conclusions. So my conclusions about PACE are that the reported PACE results cannot be taken at face value and prove they, in fact, if you actually look at their original results, from my perspective, the PACE trial proved that these treatments do not work. Not that they do work, but that they do not. And I think it should be regarded as the definitive trial of these treatments from that perspective, because it showed definitively that they don't work. The data manipulations, lack of informed consent, and other issues could lead to the conclusion that this is research misconduct according to standard definitions. Again, I'm not claiming that it definitely is, because that's not my decision to make. It looks like it to me. PACE authors have no legitimate defenses for their terrible methodological choices. They and their cronies are the anti-science crowd, like climate change deniers, not PACE, I shouldn't say PACE, not the participants in PACE, or not patients who are criticizing PACE. So the best use of PACE from my perspective is how it's being used at Berkeley and as a pedagogical tool to train epidemiologists what not to do. My colleague Bruce Levin, who had called it the height of clinical trial amateurism, actually gave a talk sometime last year, maybe last summer, how it was called How Not to Conduct a Clinical Trial, and PACE was his case study. So it's being used in the US, in this way, and I think that's the best use of it. I forgot that I had this part. How much time do I have? Am I over my time?
We've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. So how many of you have heard of the Cochrane Reviews? So Cochrane is an organization, does what they call systematic reviews or meta-analyses. So that means they take a lot of studies and they sort of combine all the results to come up with like a mega result, you know, like an uber result. And, you know, so that's useful. Unfortunately, the people who've been in charge of doing Cochrane reviews for about ME, or what they call CFS, is the Common Mental Disorders arm of Cochrane. Now, I think we can all agree that this illness does not belong in the Common Mental Disorders arm. I think it's the Common Mental Disorders, or whatever, it's the Mental Health Division. It shouldn't be there. Why is it there? The way Cochrane works is that different specialties grab the illnesses they want to deal with. Oh, you want to do that illness? Great, go ahead, that's your baby. As we know, no specialist area really owns this illness. It might be neurology, it might be, in this case, psychiatry or psychology or mental health. Sometimes it's rheumatologists, sometimes it might be gastroenterologists that people go to. So there's not really a specialty that sort of has wanted to own this except for the psychiatrists, right? So they grab this, and that's why it's there. So it's in the Common Mental Health Disorder section where it shouldn't be. So there are reviews that have looked at the data and seem to indicate, their reports indicate that, yes, CBT and GET seem to be, or at least are effective. The one that's been of contention recently is the exercise review that was last done in 2014. PACE is the largest study of the reviews. So that automatically is a problem, since, as I've documented, PACE really is not viable science. The others in the review, other studies, mostly are Oxford criteria studies, so those also are problematic, even though they may not be research misconduct. And again, all the results are based on subjective findings. This Cochrane review decided to not include the objective findings that have documented that these studies don't produce objective results that support the subjective results. So if you're going to do a review and you're going to omit the objective results that seem to indicate that people don't walk farther using pedometers, or that they're not more fit, as was the case in PACE, or that nobody actually got back to work or got off benefits, as was also the case in PACE. If you're going to pretend that those findings never happened, or you're not going to include those objective findings in your review, you're going to actually come up with better final results because you've ignored the ones that will bring down your assessments, right? That's what they did in that review. There are lots of other problems with it that have led Cochrane to last year decide that it needed to be temporarily withdrawn. That was reported and caused a big uproar and a pushback. And so even though Cochrane has decided that that review is not fit for purpose, it's still there. Cochrane has rejected they asked the authors of that review, who were, the lead author is Norwegian researcher, they asked them to do a revision. Cochrane rejected the revision, but they've still left the old one that they've already decided isn't fit for purpose up. So it's not really clear what will happen next. They've also acknowledged that they need to move it from common mental disorders, but where and to who and all, that's all unresolved. They promised, there was an indication that they were going to make that decision about where to move it before the end of last year, but it hasn't happened yet, and so we don't really know what's going to happen. But Cochrane, the big problem is that the only really remaining defense of PACE is that, well, the Cochrane reviews found the same thing, so PACE is fine. And that's what the Medical Research Council essentially said when it defended PACE last summer. So the Cochrane reviews are what kind of are partly standing in the way. Nobody's really citing PACE very much as authoritative anymore because I think the problems are so now public. But they're citing Cochrane, they're citing the other studies that are similar in terms of objective, no objective outcomes and so on. And they're saying, oh, well, Cochrane found it, so it's okay. So Cochrane is a real problem that has to be dealt with before any of this stuff is going to get resolved. Oh, wait a minute. What did I do? Oh, so there have been some responses, which I think have been good. I probably haven't updated this. Oh, actually, I did at the end. So in the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control, after enormous amounts of pressure and unwillingness to actually take any action, removed these two treatments from their recommendations for what they call now ME/CFS. That happened in the summer a year and a half ago, so 2016, or no, summer of 2017. That was a really important move. I will modestly say I think I had something to do with that. In the UK, NICE at first decided they were not going to pursue an update of their 2007 guidelines. Then in a kind of uproar, they reversed themselves, which was a good decision. A Dutch advisory committee had last year recommended that GET should not be used in the Netherlands. That was a new finding from them. Berkeley, as I said, it's used in doctoral epidemiology seminars as a perfect case study of really awful science. I should add that there was just a parliamentary hearing recently in the UK where those attending passed a resolution basically calling for no more CBT and GET for ME, more research for biomedical stuff, and again, stopping terrorizing families by threatening to take their kids away if they don't want their kids to have the treatments that are being recommended. That's a terrible problem in the UK. So that's also, I should add that. And also, I've just reported last week that after batting away at this for a while, some studies by Professor Esther Crawley at Bristol University are now officially under investigation for ethical and methodological violations. That one I take full credit for. I imagine that's one of the reasons why she would claim that I'm harassing her. So I want to thank the brilliant patients and advocates who first dissected this. There are too many of them to name, but I've piggybacked my work on theirs. They deserve the credit. I took a lot of what they did my own investigation, put it into readable journalism form, and was able to get attention from outside academics that patients were not necessarily able to do. I have so much gratitude for my colleague Vincent Racaniello. He trusted in my reporting. It's very, very clear to me, and I'm sure to him, that had I been wrong, we could have been sued up the wazoo, as we say in the U.S. It's very significant that I've had threats issued against me. Legal-sounding threats. I've been accused of libel by Professor Crawley. Bristol University has complained to my university multiple times with unspecified, I haven't seen the letters, but apparently my behavior is bad. So Vincent, trusted my reporting and published what I wrote. And had I been wrong, we both could have been in a lot of trouble. I have not been sued. I have not been charged with harassment. So I consider all these claims to be really nonsense and just a way for these researchers to deflect attention from their poor research. These were the first experts that allowed me to cite them in my original report. My professor, Arthur Reingold, is a head of epidemiology at Berkeley. He's been a great support for me. I want to thank Berkeley for valuing my academic freedom and allowing me to continue my work. The Center for Global Public Health, which is run by Professor Reingold, is my unit at Berkeley, so they are committed to my work. And my other faculty and colleagues and everywhere who understand nonsense, and everybody who signed my open letters. And I think that's probably my last slide. Yes, that's it.
Well then, thank you. Give him a big round of applause. So we have seen that there has been bad research, and unfortunately, patients are paying the price, either by useless treatments or treatments that can even be harmful.
Thank you. And I declare my interest here that I've done many years of clinical research. I also say I haven't done it in very many recent years. But what I hear from you is, where was the ethics committee? The ethics committee, you can't do anything without ethics committees. What were they doing? They were the criminals in this, because if they're ignoring what's going on, they're not doing their job.
Well, yes, I would avoid the use of the word criminals, just because I'm in a contentious situation at the moment. Yes, I would say that the ethics committees have not done their jobs properly, and I would say that in the UK, anyway, there's been a sort of mass delusion, or I would say mass hysteria, that this is viable research and that what they've done is okay. I simply do not understand how anybody can look at this research and think that, but as I said, they're in a mass delusion, and the entire UK academic and medical establishment that supported this ridiculous research, from my perspective, they all have no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. They're all naked, and I really, really do not understand it, and I don't understand why the research ethics committees are doing this. There's obviously a culture of deference in the UK that I don't necessarily adhere to being in the US. I have a feeling that some of it has to do with the fact that these are prestigious people, prestigious institutions, and prestigious journals, and they don't think they really need to answer to anybody, and they think that anybody who challenges them is de facto harassing them, apparently, especially if they're challenging them in, kind of obnoxious ways or very publicly, very openly. But I don't understand the research ethics committees in this, and I think that's a huge problem and one of the reasons why we're in this mess. Yes.
We have a doctor in the audience, I believe, so one professional question.
Thank you for your fluent speech. It was too fast to take all the details. No, it's okay. I have missed your explanation. What was the motives of these researchers?
Okay, so I didn't explain what I think of their motives. I really don't want to speculate about their motives because they've never talked to me. Well, I mean, I've had some exchange with some of them, but no, I can't speculate on their motives. Or, well, I can. Or I can put out some specific... Let's just say, okay, they've... I can say for myself, if I've spent 30 years proposing a theory, and then I'm researching whether my theory is going to work, I would probably prefer that it worked, because otherwise I know that I would suffer some reputational damage. If I've spent a lot of time telling insurance companies and the government that patients with this illness should be getting cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, then probably, from my perspective, I would want to make sure that my studies prove that that was the case. Now, is that their reasons? I have no idea. I've speculated that they probably realized that they would suffer reputational damage. And the PACE authors initially, Queen Mary University of London, did accuse me of possibly causing reputational damage and unleashing social media abuse and so on. So I think if one looks at the histories, one can come up with one's own speculations about why they might have done this. But it's not for me to say or to talk about their motives, except to say, well, there are things one might think about as the reasons, but I have no idea if those are the reasons. I really can't speak to their psychology. I can't speak to why anybody would look at this and sort of claim that it's good research. I think they're kind of deluded about the quality of their research. And I think at this point, I would actually bet that maybe they probably do believe that their research is good. So I have no way of knowing whether they know their research is bad or whether they really think that I'm just being horrible by pointing out and making such mistakes. What I can say is that whatever responses they've given have not been satisfactory. If they were, that we wouldn't have a continuing controversy. So they haven't been able to answer the critics to the satisfaction of of anybody but themselves and the other people that already have believed in this paradigm. What their motives are, again, is, I can speculate, but it's not for me to say definitively. I can just make assumptions based on the facts, which is, they have reputations to defend. And, at 60 or 65, I'm 62, would I want to be in a position where I sort of essentially have to disavow everything I've done for 30 years and acknowledge that, well, maybe my research has not only been bad, but I've harmed people in the process. Now, it would be very hard for anybody of a certain age to acknowledge that to themselves. Now, is that going on here? I have no idea. Would that be going on for me? Were I in a comparable situation? Absolutely. Would I behave in this way? I hope not.
Hi, I was born in the UK and was treated with graded exercise, walked into physio, but used a wheelchair from that point. I was actually stopped by a physio because they said it was obviously damaging. You've done some amazing work by publicising this trial because patients, as you say before, were making these statements and we were made out as hysterical, mad, crazy people. And
still are.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. How as patients, do we talk to doctors, to benefit offices, to people like that, and to try and make them realise that no, we aren't making this illness up. I would love to have a mental illness that could be fixed with graded exercise. I would love to have not had this illness for 24 years. And I know
you don't have a prejudice against psychiatry?
No, I don't. I really don't. But how do we speak to them without them thinking, you're mad, you're making it up, you love this wheelchair, you love being at home all the time watching daytime television?
Well, so one of my motives, especially doing the open letters, was to put out something that people could say to their doctor or whoever, look, so this is being claimed in the UK, but this is not the international standard of care anymore, and here are 100+ experts from Harvard, Berkeley, Columbia, and wherever who say this is nonsense. And here are 10 MPs, and here are 70 organizations around the world. If you want to call patients crazy and hysterical, then you have to call all these people from Harvard and Columbia and wherever also crazy and hysterical because they're saying the exact same things. This idea that patients are prejudiced against psychiatry is just really ridiculous. I have not seen any evidence that patients are against psychiatry. Even they're not against cognitive behavior therapy. They're just against the cognitive behavior therapy that's trying to convince them that they don't respond to the illness that they know that they have, or that's trying to convince them that it's all just, deconditioning. That's what they're protesting. And again, I don't want to say, I can't say that researchers in this field have not received abusive and angry and threatening emails. I've been a reporter for a long time. I've also received angry and threatening emails from people. That's, it happens. But to then take that number, that kind of those kinds of incidents, and extrapolate that to the entire patient population, and to, by definition, define, for example, the filing of Freedom of Information requests as vexatious, or anybody protesting the PACE trial seems to be lumped into the category of crazy and hysterical, and I seem to be portrayed as kind of a madman, you American madman coming over here just to cause havoc, or whatever they think about me. It's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. They've done bad science and they haven't really been held accountable to it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. All participants, patients, doctors, politicians, there are people defending good science. And if that's troublemaking, then we have to continue making trouble.